The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast.
Hey, Ben.
Hi.
Well, you came home for Thanksgiving?
I did. I'm here.
And now, because you're home, you're being forced into this podcast. You're going to help me introduce Frithjoff Bergmann's book, New Work, New Culture. He's the guest on this podcast.
Right.
And I should say, and I have to say, and I think I'll say it to you as a disclaimer at the front, that Mr. Bergmann, Professor Bergmann, is not a socialist. He does not want his work associated with Marxism. He made a point to tell me during the conversation and then afterwards by email that he was concerned that his work on ending the job system not be associated with Marxism or socialism. And so understanding that, he's, by the way, Mr. Bergmann is in his 90s now.
Wow.
So in order to meet his wishes, in order to be true to my agreement with him, I'm making that disclaimer here at the start. Frithjoff Bergmann is not a Marxist or a socialist. He's not interested in socialism in his work. New Work, New Culture is not in any way related to, or at least not very directly related to, socialism or the project of socialism. It's a book that we've published. I think it's worthwhile. I think it's a book that will be particularly valuable and useful for people after the revolution. And
you're not very good at this.
And I want everyone to listen to it now. Happy Thanksgiving, happy holidays. I should say happy holidays from Zero Books.
Frithjoff Bergmann is a professor emeritus of philosophy at the University of Michigan, where he taught courses on existentialism, Nietzsche and continental philosophy, Hegel, and Marx. Most importantly, though, Bergmann is the director of the Center for New Work and the author of the book New Work, New Culture. Professor Bergmann, thank you for allowing us to publish your book and for coming on to the Zero Books podcast.
Thank you don't thank me for letting you publish my book. I'm thanking you for doing it, and very happy with what you have so far done.
Well, we are pleased to have done it, and I know that it's an important book and that you've spent a great deal of time working on the thesis and the project of New Work. And that, so where I want to start with is that story of how you came to write New Work, New Culture, or to put it differently, how you came to consider the subject of work to be important philosophically and politically.
It is certainly a justified question because lots of people originally, when I first started this, said that work was not an interesting subject, that there was nothing to be said about work, that I should change my mind and saddle a different horse and ride on a different horse. But I stuck to my guns in this case and insisted that I did want to write about work and that I was very sure that work would become, in due time, not next week, but it would become a very central subject. And if I may be boastful right now, right at the beginning, I would say that was one of the ideas on which I was not wrong. That is, in comparison to what when I first started to now, work is of much greater interest than it was even just 10 or 20 years ago. People now are very interested in what the future of work will be like, of how work will be organized, And so work has become, for many people, a genuinely fascinating subject, which was not the case 10 years ago.
Or when you were beginning your project. When did you start being interested in work as a philosophical question?
A long time ago. And I felt that work would become a philosophically very important subject. But let me maybe back around and say it was a little bit the other way around. I had done some work on work. Long before that, I had written something called Culture After the Elimination of Work, which was something that I wrote before anything else, and I was at that point writing as a philosopher. It is worth mentioning that lots of people, at the very beginning when I started this, insisted that I was making a mistake, that I had clearly done fairly interesting things before, but that work would turn out to be a dud, that work would turn out to be a waste of my time. But I was very sure that that wasn't the case, and I stuck to work. And I want to be boastful about this and say that, of course, 10 or 20 years ago, work was nothing like what it is now. Now it is one of the key and most important subjects that is constantly asked and is at the very center of debate, which was not true 20 years ago and not even 10 years ago. So, go ahead.
Coming out of a kind of a Marxist perspective, it's sort of almost odd to me that people would not take work to be at the center of their politics anyhow. And I would extend that to the realm of philosophy. But I'm curious to know to what extent, and we'll come back to this question, but to what extent your scholarship on Hegel and Marx influenced your interest in work as a academic topic or as a political topic or philosophical topic?
I would say yes, but a qualified yes, because I remember I was teaching at various universities, including Stanford and Berkeley and other name universities, and at that point, early on, and I mean now in the 70s, people warned me and said, don't get involved in work because it will be a waste of your time.
Well, I would say that many workers would hold that same sentiment, that work is a waste of their time today. but your book is all about changing that.
It was beginning to be language, but it was much more what is the mind, and how is the mind structured, and how is the mind influenced. That was what philosophy was about at that point. So the central questions had to do with the mind and not with work.
And the reason why I brought up Marx and Engels is because I remember Engels particularly would argue that before you can have a culture or an identity within that culture or a science or a religion, you had to first have a means of subsistence. You had to have work. And that this was the great revelation of Marx's ideology or Marx's philosophy, was to understand the centrality of productive work to life. So let's talk about your book more directly. In it, you talk about escaping from the job system and the resistance. At the beginning of your book, you talk about the resistance that you encounter when you talk about changing or getting beyond the job system. How should people think about the job system as we know it today, and have there always been jobs?
Well, to take your second phrase first, there of course have not always been jobs. In fact, I make a point of saying that the job system as we now know it is probably only around 200 years old. And it didn't exist in this shape before. And by this shape, I mean it was not something where I worked for somebody else, got paid for doing that work, and that was the job system. And that was the core of what I was doing. I was making money by working on a job. That is not at all how, for most of human history, that was not how people thought about it. Even when I was starting, the majority of people were interested in farming, and farming was the main work that people were doing, and it was not jobs. And that's something I emphasize in the book, that there's quite a big difference between working as a farmer and working on a job. And in fact, an American hero, Jefferson, argued very strongly against the idea of jobs. He felt that agriculture was far more important than work, and work would be destructive of people. And agriculture, working on a farm, to Jefferson's minds, was far more productive and interesting than working on a farm.
And one of the reasons he might have thought that was because when you are a farmer working for yourself, producing your own means of existence and subsistence, you are more independent. You don't become dependent on another. You don't become as subservient. And in a democratic society, having strong, independent individuals is important. That's really the bedrock of a democratic society.
Right. You're right about that. I mean, you're right about Jefferson. That's what he thought.
Do you feel as though one of the reasons to break with the job system is similarly psychological or cultural, that people, because I know that one of the major tenets of the new work is that we need to find jobs that we really, really want, that we need to find work to be something that's fulfilling rather than something that's pure drudgery.
Right.
And your new work would be, in a way, a return to that more agrarian culture.
In some, yes,
Is that right?
Exactly. That is, I do call the book New Work, New Culture. And new work is very importantly a different way of thinking about work. That is, work is not, in my view, needs to be very different from what it has been in the recent past. And the thing I emphasize the most, you already mentioned, namely that we need to restructure our culture and our economy so that people will do work that they really seriously want to do, that they have a passion about, that they feel liberated by. So the conception I'm trying to advance under the heading of new work is very different from what most people think of as work.
Walk me through what would make it different, the new work in the new culture. would it be? I mean, I know that it would be both a matter of changing the kinds of work that people did and their relationship to that. They would be finding work that they really wanted and that suited their desires. But it would also be work done on a different scale, with different technologies, and I think with somewhat different aims. So can you walk me through the way that new work would be different, and to the degree to which it would break from the job system? Like how should we conceive of the job system as compared to the new work?
I think of the job system as something close to a calamity, a catastrophe, something that now has become so dysfunctional. There are so many objections that I enumerated in the book to the job system, that we now are at the point where we should and could liberate ourselves from the job system. And
right. In your book, you mentioned two major problems with the job system, which is the first one would be unemployment, the fact that the job system doesn't provide work for everyone, and then the second problem with the job system would be employment, namely the way in which people are treated and come to think of themselves and what they have to endure when they are employed.
But if I may jump in the passage to which you just now referred, I emphasize that unemployment is not the main calamity of work. That the idea that everything is hunky-dory and wonderful just as long as people are not unemployed is exactly something that I reject. That is.
Yes, I know. Yeah, both employment and unemployment are major problems with the job system. Again, coming from a Marxist perspective, one of the things that defines the job system, and that you mentioned it earlier, is the fact that you're working for a wage. You're working for your subsistence. And so I'm wondering how new work would break from that wage relation.
It would be a matter of several steps, but ideally, the goal of new work would be for people to have work that they really desire, that they passionately want to do, and to do that in a fashion that supports them. So that one of the things I am intending on writing more about in the next book is how in the near future people will do work, but they will not do it under compulsion. They will do work that they want to do, but work that they want to do will be the work that enables them to survive and to live well. Did I answer your question?
You began to. You told me what the aim would be of new work. You told me what I guess in a way it would be kind of a negative definition. It would, and even though you described it in positive terms, so the job system is one in which people are working merely to survive, whereas the new work would be work that people wanted to do in order to live well. That would be the purpose and highest aim of their life, would be the work that they'd selected based on their own personal psychology and their own real desires. But what I'm unclear about, and again, you asked me if I had read your book, and I had, but it's been over a month.
But go ahead and hit me over the head.
Well, what I want to ask is, when you were to do this work that you really, really wanted to do, would you be remunerated with a wage for it, or would you have some other way of sharing in the materials that other people had created and sharing in the commonwealth of society?
I think more the former than the latter. That is, my conception is that what we should aim for, what we should reach, what it will take some time to accomplish, but it will be accomplished, is the idea of doing work that one wants to do and making that work something that one can live off and that supports one and that gives one dignity and all kinds of things. So I think of work as of something that has been downgraded in the more recent past, but that really could be something quite magnificent compared to what we have now.
And you're not speaking here only as a theoretician. You have done workshops and done practical experiments in the world around new work.
Very much so, and I have worked in some of the big industries, especially in the automobile industry, for a long time, and I've tried to make proposals there. In fact, the original ideas of new work were proposals about the work in the car industry. I feel a little uncomfortable. I would like my friend to enter into this conversation with questions he has.
Okay.
Can we do that?
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely.
He's now moving across the room and we'll sit down. And we both talked, of course, about this conversation before today.
How do you think it's going? Is it a little bit unexpected, or?
I did not think that we would spend that much time talking about to what extent this had to do with Marx.
Here's the famous passage from Capital Volume 1. A commodity is a mysterious thing simply because in it the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor. Because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor is presented to them as a social relation, existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor. This is the reason why the products of labor become commodities, social things whose qualities are at the same time perceptible and imperceptible by the senses. In the same way, the light from an object is perceived by us not as a subjective excitation of the optic nerve, but as the objective form of something outside the eye itself. But in the act of seeing, there is, at all events, an actual passage of light from one thing to another, from the external object to the eye. There is a physical relation between physical things, but it is different with commodities. There, the existence of the thing qua commodities and the value relation between the products of labor which stamps them as commodities have absolutely no connection with their physical properties and with the material relations arising therefrom. There is a definite social relation between men that assumes, in their eyes, the fantastic form of a relation between things. In order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must have recourse to the mist-enveloped regions of the religious world. In that world, the productions of the human brain appear as independent beings endowed with life, and entering into relation both with one another and the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands. This I call the fetishism, which attaches itself to the products of labor so soon as they are produced as commodities, and which is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities.
But what I wanted to ask was, when you are working with people, when you are helping them develop new work or strategies towards new work, how that's worked, how that happens practically. What you've done with people on the job or people who are looking for a new kind of relationship to work, and for instance, how you help people discover what their desires actually are when it comes to work.
Maybe I will try to give some answer to that question first. But my friend is now sitting next to me, and he will answer it in a different way. I think it is very straightforward that I actually encourage people to think hard about what it is that they want to do. For most people, this is a major shift. It is an innovation. It is not something that they have been asked before. Most people were told that they should do something that pays the bills, and something sort of a necessity to which they should submit themselves. The idea of turning this around and saying, no, it's not just a question of doing something that will pay the bills, but you should do something that really is fulfilling and that is enriching and that is work what you want to do. The whole idea of work as you want it, work that you do want, that was actually, to begin with, one of the key ideas of new work, that one should shift around work from its recent past, where it is mainly drudgery and mainly something that one does because I use the phrase as a mild disease, and instead of that, look around, look inside you, look among your friends, look about all the different kinds of work that are being done around you, and focus on the things that people find immensely gratifying. And I emphasize words that most people don't. I mean, that work can be something sensuous. Work can be something delightful. Work can be something that can be the best part of your life. That seems to me important and something that is in the near future, but we have not reached that.
Can I just...
I was going to say...
Okay, I'm going to enter the conversation by venturing into something that I'm quite ignorant about. And I'm always comfortable doing that. But my understanding is that Marx, I think probably the first authentically Marxist society was the Soviet Union. And my understanding is that, and this is where New Work contrasts with Marx, I think, quite definitely. My understanding is that Marx really didn't lay out a blueprint of what a communist society would be like, and that when the Russians overthrew the Tsar and set up their own Marxist state, they kind of had to make things up as they went along. Now, this may be completely off the wall, but my understanding of New Work, my understanding of what life was like in Russia was that everybody still had jobs. And work was required of everyone, but everybody had jobs, so it was a job system in which profits were not made, and life was quite sparse in terms of the physical needs. But New Work contrasts with that very definitely, in that the people living in communist Russia just plain were not happy, is my impression. They were not happy with their work. They were not happy with their physical, with their material well-being, and New Work, I think, is a completely different approach.
May I jump in on that and say, you see, to understand the origin of New Work, it's important to put into the picture that I spent quite some time in Russia and in other communist countries. I was very impressed with how miserable people experienced their work and how miserable they experienced their life. And it was really that misery that gave me the impulse to start something different. And New Work is very emphatically an attempt to do something different from Marxist way of thinking of New Work.
Well, my understanding of Marx, just as this is really a tangent, so bear with me, but my understanding of Marx is that, and the history of Marxism, is that it has been a struggle to try to take up Marx's critique of, say, political economy, as he wrote about it in Capital, as an example, but also in other places, and implement a political project around it. And that while it's true that Lenin and the Bolshevik Party had that aim, they also had that aim within a context of a society where many of the things that Marx described in his work had not yet been fully developed. So they weren't really entering into a fully developed capitalist society, but one in which was more agrarian. And there was a lot of debate and problems around how to develop a new economy in the Soviet Union. Ultimately, what happened was that rather than develop socialism, or what Marx might describe in, say, the Critique of the Gotha program, they, as a transitionary move, really tried to develop industry and capitalism through the state. And so what they had there was what some Marxists would say is called state capitalism. And from my perspective, now not all Marxists would agree with this, but from my perspective, it's no wonder that everyone was miserable.
I see. Do you think of yourself as a Marxist?
I do. I think of myself as a Marxist, but I don't think of myself as a Bolshevik. I for a long time called myself a wannabe Marxist. In other words, I was reading Marx and I was trying to understand how it could lead to a political project. But if you look at something like the Critique of the Gotha program or the Critique of the Erfurt program, one of the things that's clear is that even in Marx's own time, the political projects that were coming out of the so-called Marxist tradition were often not very much in accord with Marx's own writings and theories. And it's important to also realize that he would put aside some of his more devastating critiques in the name of kind of political solidarity, even in the 19th century. So like in the Social Democratic Party, or the SPD, the SDP, yeah. No, it's SPD. It's the German Social Democratic Party. They often enough were taking up something closer to an evolutionary social democratic approach to developing the power of the working class and helping working people, but they weren't fully taking on board Marxist critique. And I think it was never fully taken on board in a political project as much as some people like Lenin and Trotsky made an attempt to. And I think that many other people who might have been thought of as Marxist were actually more Lassallean or coming from some other part of the socialist tradition more than Marx. Go ahead.
Do you mind if I am a little impertinent at this point?
No, I enjoy impertinence.
Okay, well, you can get your fill of that from me.
Okay, all right.
No, I mean, I want to emphasize that so far we have mainly talked about Marxism, and in my book, I made a great point of not talking about Marx. In fact,
Well, you do. You talk about Marx, but you talk about socialism and the death of socialism.
Yeah, I do about that. But this death of socialism, it's
right. So I'm interested to know your one of the questions I had written down actually, and I'll allow you to be more impertinent in a moment. But
you will.
One of the questions I'd written down was whether or not today, with the rise of Bernie Sanders in the U.S. and Corbyn in the U.K., that you would still hold to the idea that socialism is completely dead. I mean, it's certainly a buzzword on people's lips today, in a way that it wasn't certainly 10 or 20 years ago. And it seems like, the return of the word socialism has come along with the return of the emphasis on work. So I'm wondering if you would hold with the idea that socialism is entirely dead.
No, I would not. But I would say that I, in my book, avoided to talk about socialism to any great extent. I did mention it, but it was not crucial. In the book, I talked about the death of socialism and that we really needed to go beyond what socialism had tried to do. And so I feel a little uncomfortable in this conversation about socialism and Marxism because that's, if I may be blunt about it and maybe a little selfish about it, that's really not the subject of my book.
Right. Well, let's return to your book. I want to ask you about
having said that.
No, I don't mind you having said that, and it directs me back to your book. My defense of Marxism was truly a tangent there. But going back to finding work that people really, really want, when you've worked on that, have you worked on that in conjunction with finding smaller scale techniques for production? And do those things need to come hand in hand, do you think?
Very much so. I mean, in fact, one of the chapters in my book is about the small-scale manufacturing. And that is something where I had personal relationships with, for example, Andreas Gebhardt, but also other people. And yes, I very much think that small-scale manufacturing was something that I tried to articulate and to develop and to move beyond where socialism had been.
Right. What is it about this the small scale? I mean, I think I know, but I want to give you an opportunity to tell the listeners. What is it about moving to a small scale, more local approach to production that gives people the freedom to work on what in a way that's sensuous and that fulfills their desires and that moves away from drudgery?
Right. Well, that seems to me pretty close to self-evident. That is, if one has the opportunity to work and one thing that is somewhat different about me compared to other people who have written about this, I have not only written about it, I have practiced it. I have worked in shops. I have worked in small shops. I've worked in all kinds of different manufacturing. And in the process of working in these, I realized that a great deal of liberation is accomplished through working in small scales, with small factories, with small machines, not with the big factories. I worked for General Motors and other gigantic corporations, but I try to emphasize that is not the only way in which one could develop production, that production could be very different from that. And I think to some extent what recently has happened has proven me right. That is that now small-scale production has become more prominent than it was 10 years ago.
And when you've done this work in smaller factories, you found that people are more personally connected to their work, and that's because they have the power to develop their own techniques for work.
It's a huge difference, and it's a difference that I think has often been underestimated. That is, that if people have an opportunity to work in small scales, in settings that are essentially intimate settings, they become much more involved. They become much more productive. In fact, that was one of my starting points, that manufacturing on the grand scale, the way my beginnings were with General Motors and Chrysler and Ford, those were not really ways in which one could achieve one's own effort at manufacturing. One was pushed into a prefabricated system, and that is not what I had in mind, and it is not what I think. It's not what my book was an effort to pronounce.
Something that is in the book that I think should be brought out is that Frithjoff has worked with Indian tribes in northern Canada and prisons for young people that are maximum security prisons because they're dangerous. He's worked with the down and outs in New York City. And the one thing that they have in common is that they find themselves with nothing to do. And what you do is you approach the entire group and said, well, why don't you do this? And why don't you do that? And they'll talk about it and maybe reject it. But like building motorcycles, I believe, was something that the people, the youth in a maximum security prison ended up doing.
Yeah.
And the incidence of violence among them went down dramatically.
Yeah, because they had a common project that they were working on together, and they could see their work.
They learned to work with each other. They learned what it was to work with others and to be constructive with others, as opposed to just being personally angry and
it was a totally different experience of work.
Right. If they had been given the opportunity to work on an assembly line producing motorcycles, the good cultural and psychological effects would not have been reached. Yeah. Could you describe a little bit about the process of what it took to build a motorcycle in a maximum security prison, and what the technological differences were, and how that came together?
I can try. One thing that struck me as important is that people said this is a very dangerous enterprise, because if in addition to all the other things that make prison for many people actually quite attractive, and that's something that impressed me, that prison offered people security, permanence, 3 meals a day, and in that way, life in prison was actually quite attractive. But out of that perspective grew the idea that if you, on top of that, give them work that they really want, there will be long lines of people trying to get into prison because it is so much more attractive than life outside.
May I just chime in? And I think we should help the reader who reads the book to understand that there are two different, and Frithjoff can correct me on this, there are two different experiences with motorcycles. One was where the prisoners purchased kits. Am I correct?
Yeah.
And they made them out of kits.
Yeah.
But there's also a motorcycle developed in one of the centers in Germany that I understand was designed from the ground up. Am I correct on that?
Right.
So there, it might help the reader to know that they shouldn't confuse the two. But
I'm guessing that process where people were designing and building a motorcycle from the ground up would be something that the process of that kind of production might be able to be taken to many different parts of the world, not just for motorcycles, but the kind of methodology that would go in to doing that kind of work would be useful in all around the world, in Indian tribes or in
very much
urban areas. Whereas buying kits would be less helpful. But so part of the new work is developing kind of the ingenuity and skills that can be used in a variety of different productive activity. Is that
right? And what Frithjoff points out is that you only need a few items, like 38 or something. I can't remember the number. The numbers, I think, have changed over the years. But you only need a few items to be happy and well cared for and everything. And that most of those items can be designed from the ground up and developed so that they are not only they're not only functional, but there's a word I'm trying to think of. I think it's
appropriate.
Well, elegant. They're elegant in their design in that they lend themselves to small scale manufacturing, but at the same time they're very, very efficient and very, very spare of non-necessities.
They're functional and elegant and, in no way an inferior product to a mass-produced motorcycle. And when you've had these different experiments, when you've worked with these different groups of people, have you ever had an opportunity to bring the products that you've made to market, even like in a community, or and how have they been received?
Quite emphatically, yes. I mean, I had the opportunity, and I worked in a town that in Austria is famous for its production of motorcycles, in Steyr. Mm-hmm. And in Steyr, we manufactured an electric among the very first efforts to make an electric motorcycle, which at that point was radically new. In the meantime, it's become common. But really, yes, it was received with alacrity, with great enthusiasm. People wanted something like that and responded very positively to what we were doing.
And often people will associate small-scale production with more expensive goods. But because of the functionality and the ingenuity that's used in production in this new work, the motorcycles aren't more expensive in the end.
Oh, no, they're not. In fact, the whole idea was to manufacture motorcycles that were efficient and functional, but also cheap. Cheaper than motorcycles normally are. And we took great pride in the low cost of those motorcycles that we manufactured in Steyr, in Austria.
So do you feel as though this new work is being picked up, that it's the process of changing from the job system to a new kind of work is already underway? Or do you feel as though there needs to be a political project to help it along?
I don't know about the last part. There's a political addition to this to help it along. Maybe so. But I don't want to say yes or no to that. It is really, my impression is that a lot of that actually has begun to happen. That what people expect from work is very different now from what it was 20 years ago. People have a very different attitude, very different expectation, very different conception of what they want from work. The idea of doing work that one really cares about, that one has a passion about, that's almost become common stock now. That is ordinary. That is something that most people have. I'm amazed at the degree to which this has become common, something that has sort of spread around. You say common kind, I say it's become a common enterprise.
What about automation? Because I know automation is a major component for your vision for new work. That today, in the Democratic primaries, there's a candidate running named Andrew Yang, who's concerned about automation creating unemployment and suggesting UBI as a way to remedy the problem of unemployment that's come on by automation. But your approach would take up automation as an opportunity for a new kind of work rather than something that would necessitate government subsidies of unemployed workers. So how does that automation function in the new work? Is it a matter of automating away some of the more difficult jobs or the jobs that are the more dehumanizing? Is it a matter of getting cheaper material through the process of automation? Both?
Both of those is very much the process of automation certainly eliminates jobs. And that would be the sentence that would be very central to what new work is about in connection with that. That is, we eliminate jobs through automation and substitute something else for the jobs that are being eliminated through automation. Differently put, many people think of automation as a calamity, as a disaster. I don't think that's at all the case. Automation can be liberating from jobs. If one takes a skeptical view of jobs, which is very much what I do, which is what the whole book is all about, then the idea is that there is something to be celebrated about automation. Automation will liberate us from jobs.
But only if we can develop a new approach to work, right? It's if we remain mired in the job system, then it will be seen as a deprivation, creating deprivation rather than an opportunity.
No, exactly. But it does seem to me that sort of connects with several of the questions you asked earlier. That is, we actually are on our way towards a new work system. We have not failed in this. That what now is about to take place is really a way of working that is very different from what work was like 20 years ago.
I want to tell you a little anecdote. A few weeks back, I actually ran a little workshop online with some people who are readers for Zero Books and who we have a book club where we'll read a book from our lineup of books that are coming out, and we selected yours to read together. And one of the members of the book club works in manufacturing. He's not on the shop floor, but he's an administrator in a manufacturing plant in Mexico. And he was very much an advocate of. He really appreciated your book, and said that when he looks around at the kinds of decisions that are being made around production in Mexico, that a lot of the suggestions you make in your book and the approaches you take in your book would be really helpful, not just in terms of making the production more efficient and making the products more cheaply available and giving people power in the factory, but also just in terms of the general conditions that people were living in. And I know that you've worked all around the world. Do you find that your approach to work is being picked up more in less developed nations than it is in, say, in the United States or in Europe?
To my mind, that has been one of the big surprises, but also one of the big causes for happiness. That in so many places where I did not expect it, for example, I spent time in India, and I was sure that new work would not go over well in India. because of Gandhi. And I was dead wrong, that on the contrary, just precisely in India and precisely because of Gandhi, people were very receptive to new work. Even though the technology that we were introducing was very different from the technologies that Gandhi had been talking about. But yes, the answer to your big question is, in less developed countries, the urge to work in a new and different kind of way has become much more pronounced than it was in the past.
And what do you think explains that difference? Is it just a matter of the urgency of the need being more strongly felt in the less developed nations, primarily? Or?
It is partly that, but actually I was about to give the conversation we are having a slight turn. And let me try that. I'm here with my friend, close friend, very admired friend, who has already spoken twice or three times. But in any case, I want him to get into this because we articulated some questions that have not been raised in the conversation now. But I would like for those questions.
Yeah, please do add your own questions into the mix.
I've been thinking for some time. We've been comparing work in a large manufacturing assembly line to work being done by a group of men using small-scale capital equipment. And the big difference, I think, between those two settings is one of class consciousness. And I guess maybe I'm using a term that's overused. But when I was working, my experience with large-scale manufacturing is that there's very much a structured social system in which if you're wearing a white hat, you have certain privileges and certain distinctions that distinguish you from the person who isn't wearing a white hat. And the guy that's sitting in the office in the plant overlooking what's happening and going through paperwork is of a different class from the guy with the white hat. And it just goes on up the line. And small-scale manufacturing, you have to cooperate with each other. You have to have group think, more or less, or you have to think together and work together in deciding how you're going to go about doing what you want to do, or what it is you want to do to begin with, and how you're going to go about it. And if we have a new culture from this new work, we might hope that these distinctions and these almost petty jealousies among each other as to what privileges they have and what they do, where they go on the weekend and so on, these will be more or less eliminated because everybody's going to be needed and everybody's going to need everybody else.
That was going to be where I went next in this. I wanted to ask you about, because we spent a lot of time talking about the new work part of your book, but I'm really interested also in the new culture. And you've pointed at it here. The new culture is one in which people are taking responsibility for one another and for the aims that they have together, it seems to me, and are more involved in the totality of their life than they would be if they were working in the old job system, where they were just given a single task maybe, or just a small little area to where they were expected to do mundane things. So I'm curious to know about the new culture and how much of that new culture maybe brings forward more innovative ways to do work.
Can I just chime in? Back in 2016 or 15, I think probably 16, Frithjoff started exposing me to new work, new culture. And I first thought in terms of religious communes of the 1800s. lasting until the 1900s, and what they were like and what life was in them was like. And whenever you would talk to me about new work, this is what would come to mind, are these people who separate themselves from the general culture and decide to live together and work together and have their projects together. And Frithjoff tended to stay away from that, or he avoided it. He didn't want to think of new culture as being another attempt at a commune. And he has
not a commune.
It's not a commune. At least what he had in mind wasn't. But I was stuck on these things, and I went into a study of different communes in the United States. And one of them was, the only thing I can think of is Hutterite, but I don't think it's either Amana or some other group that had a large community or set of communities in Iowa. But they were concentrating on independence. They wanted to buy as little from the outside world as possible. And I think maybe, now we speak in terms of new culture, but I'm still drawn back to the fact that we need to learn from some of these old systems of separating from the general culture and so coming up with your own community.
So can I ask, Frithjoff, why are you not as convinced about the need for a communal approach to developing new work and a new culture?
I'm a little bit surprised. Am I much less?
Well, you just said that you were resisting it, that it was not going to be.
I said, well, I'll use Frithjoff's exact words if I can recall them. Something about people who wear funny clothes. And that
was the Amish.
That is in its own way a set of setting up yourself as a separate and superior community, public. And I think maybe that was what Frithjoff protested, was that they wear funny clothes and they do funny things, but new work would be very much, there's a word I'm trying to think of, secular. Would be very much a secular but different secular experience.
Let me try to answer your question to me, if I may. I felt that the kind of things that grew up in communes were very limited in their size. And from the very beginning, I had the ambition, the hope of creating something that would eventually become very sweeping and something that would be slowly but steadily implemented in many different countries. And if I may say so, some of that has already begun to happen. And I don't think that could have happened as a growth out of communes. It was something that needed very different roots in order to develop. But it has developed, and it will develop further.
So is it a matter of, forgive me for this, because this is going to sound Marxist, but is it a matter of in this new work and society where you would hold on to the innovation that we experience under capitalism and the interconnectedness of the different societies through the market much more strongly than you would in a commune where you're producing for it's sort of more like subsistence labor in a commune where you're producing for your community, whereas in a new work situation you would be producing goods that may be traded in the world in the world market, and you would be coordinating with people who are manufacturing things across the world. Is
Very
that
much so, yes. And I suppose that's partly why I resisted your efforts to constantly relate this to Marxism. I actually very much believe in the market system and think that the market system is something that could spread worldwide and be successful worldwide if it was done differently from how we have done it.
It's a matter of history that there are college students who in their dorm rooms designed a TV made up of different parts from around the world, and they can set up plants or contract with plants in different parts of the world and have things made super cheap and way undersell what's being sold by conventional manufacturing. And the one thing that came out of the book that I'm reading now, I should explain that I haven't finished reading New Work, New Culture as it is published in English in paper now. I read a...
Published by you.
Well, anyway, published by whomever, but I read...
Published by Zero Books in John Hunt Publishing.
Right.
Yeah.
And I read an e-book more or less. It was a PDF of a 500 and some page PDF that Frithjoff sent me that I read some time ago, and that's my exposure to the text of New Work. And right now I'm reading the book and finding it quite a bit of an improvement and quite a bit different. But the one thing that Frithjoff points out is that it's not at all unusual now if you want to order a bookshelf and you want to get it as cheaply as possible, you'll have it shipped to you in a box and you'll assemble it yourself. And that is going to become more and more how we provide our needs. And I see no reason why we can't rely upon the internet to integrate or to coordinate the activities of large numbers of different small shops to build whatever it is we want to build. And we may end up having to buy a few parts from the outside world. But again, going back to the experience of the Amana, I think it's the Amana that decided to be as independent as possible. Not to them. I can easily see where small shops where people are doing what they really, really want, are providing each other with the tools to build anything they want to build. And you just order it from around the globe and you bring it together and you put it together and there you have it. So I think that's the route that's one of the changes that is taking place right now.